At some point during their time in France, a significant number of British expats have a thought. It usually arrives on Tuesday afternoon, possibly during a particularly long lunch, and it goes something like this. I could do this for myself. Set up on my own, work for my own clients on my own terms from my own kitchen table overlooking my own French garden. It's an appealing thought. France, to its credit, has made self-employment more accessible than it used to be. But before you hand in your notice and order business cards, there are some things you need to understand about how self-employment works in France. Because it's not quite like the UK, not quite like anything really. Welcome back to the Expat Accountant. I'm Ad, a UK qualified accountant and British expat living in France. I promised a dedicated video on self-employment back in video 7 on social charges. Today is that video. We'll cover the main business structures available to you, how tax and social charges work for each, the interaction with UK tax, and the things that catch people out. Quick disclaimer, as always, general information, not personal advice. Right, let's get into it. Let's start with the main self-employment structures available to British expats in France, because this is the first decision you need to make and it shapes everything that follows. The micro-entrepreneur. This is France's simplified self-employment regime, formerly known as the auto-entrepreneur, rebranded in 2016, but still widely called by the old name. It's the most popular starting point for British expats setting up on their own in France, and with good reason. Registration is quick and free, administration is minimal, and the tax and social charges system is straightforward. You pay a flat percentage of your turnover, not your profit, your turnover, covering both social charges and optionally income tax. No business accounts required, no VAT in most cases, no complicated expense calculations. The trade-off is that you cannot deduct business expenses. If your costs are low, a consultant, a coach, a writer, a translator, the micro-entrepreneur regime can be very efficient. If your costs are high relative to your revenue, it becomes less attractive quickly. The entreprise individuelle. If your turnover exceeds micro-entrepreneur thresholds, or if you need to deduct real business expenses, you move into the standard sole trader regime, the entreprise individuelle. This operates more like UK self-employment. You declare actual profit, deduct actual expenses, and pay tax and social charges on the net profit result. More administration, but more flexibility. The SARL. This is France's equivalent of a limited company, a separate legal entity, limited liability, corporate structure. For most British expats starting out, this is more complexity than is needed. But for larger businesses, those with partners, or those with significant liability concerns, it's worth considering. The tax treatment depends on how the SARL is structured and how you pay yourself, a topic that deserves its own dedicated video. Portage salarial. This is a uniquely French concept that doesn't really have a UK equivalent. You work as a freelancer, but through an umbrella company, which employs you, bills your clients, deducts social charges and tax, and pays you a net salary. You get the flexibility of freelancing with the social security coverage of employment, including unemployment insurance, which standard self-employment in France does not provide. The cost is higher charges, but for those who value the safety net, it can be worth it. Given that most British expats starting out in self-employment in France will begin as a micro-entrepreneur, let's go into more detail on how it actually works. Turnover limits. For 2026, the micro-entrepreneur thresholds are €83,600 for service providers and liberal professions, so consultants, coaches, translators, therapists and similar, and €203,100 for commercial activities involving the sale of goods. Exceed these limits for 2 consecutive years and you move out of the micro regime into the standard regime automatically. Social charges. This is where it gets important and where there has been a significant change. From January 2026, the social charge rate for liberal professions, most service-based activities, is 26.1% of turnover. That is on top of income tax, and it is on turnover, not profit. So if you earn €50,000 in fees and have €20,000 of costs, you pay social charges on €50,000, not on the profit of €30,000. For people with relatively low costs, this is manageable. For those with higher costs, it can be punishing. It's worth modelling before you commit. Income tax. You have 2 options for income tax as a micro-entrepreneur. The standard option is to declare your turnover on your French tax return, after which a flat rate abatement, a deduction, is applied. For service providers, this is 34%, so you declare your turnover. France automatically deducts 34% representing assumed costs, and you pay income tax on the remaining 66%. The alternative is the versement libératoire, a prepayment option where you pay income tax as a flat percentage of turnover alongside your social charges each month or quarter. This simplifies cash flow, but it is only advantageous if your marginal tax rate is 30% or above. At lower tax rate, the standard declaration route is generally cheaper. VAT. This is one of the most misunderstood points for micro-entrepreneurs and worth being very clear about. The VAT exemption and the micro-entrepreneur turnover thresholds are 2 entirely separate things with 2 entirely separate limits. For service providers and liberal professions, the VAT exemption threshold in 2026 is €37,500. Below this, you don't charge VAT and can't reclaim it. Above, VAT applies, even if you remain within the micro-entrepreneur turnover threshold of €83,600. So it is entirely possible to be a micro-entrepreneur and yet be VAT registered. The 2 things are not the same. I should mention that France spent much of 2025 proposing, suspending and ultimately abandoning various reforms to reduce this threshold dramatically. At one point, a single threshold of 25,000 was proposed before being definitively scrapped in November 2025. The current thresholds remain in place, but it's worth keeping an eye on future finance bills as this area has clearly been under review. For most British expat micro-entrepreneurs working with private clients below the threshold, the VAT exemption is a simplification. For those working with VAT-registered businesses, being VAT registered can actually be advantageous. It allows you to reclaim input VAT on costs. ACRE. New micro-entrepreneurs may be eligible for a 50% reduction in social charges for the first year of activity. Eligibility conditions have tightened considerably in recent years, and not everyone qualifies, but it is worth checking when you register. Here's something that surprises many British expats who set up as self-employed in France. Your social security coverage changes significantly. As a self-employed person in France, you are affiliated to the SSI, Sécurité Sociale des Indépendants, which merged into the general social security system in 2020. You're covered for healthcare, pension contributions and certain other benefits. What you are not covered for is unemployment. France does not provide unemployment benefit to the self-employed. If your business dries up, there is no French equivalent of the UK's universal credit for self-employed people. This is one of the reasons the portage salarial option appeals to some people despite its higher cost. For British expats who previously held a S1 certificate and accessed French healthcare through UK social security coverage, the self-employment situation changes things. Once you are affiliated to the French social security system as a self-employed person, you are no longer accessing healthcare through an S1. This has implications for your social charges rate on investment income. You may no longer benefit from the reduced 7.5% rate we discussed in video 7. This is one of the most important and least understood interactions between self-employment status and the broader French tax position for British expats. If you hold an S1 and are considering self-employment, take specific advice before registering. Right, what does HMRC want to know about your French self-employment income? As a French tax resident running a business in France, your self-employment income is primarily taxable in France. The UK-France double tax treaty allocates business profits to the country where the business activity takes place, which is France. So you should not be paying UK income tax on your French self-employment income, and you should not need to include it on a UK self-assessment return as taxable income, though the interaction depends on your specific residency position and whether you have other UK income. However, and this is important, if you are still within the UK tax system in some way, or if you have a mixed picture of UK and French income, clarity on the treaty position is essential. Don't assume, check. National insurance is a separate question. Self-employed people in France are not paying UK national insurance. You're paying French social charges instead. This means your UK NI record is not being built up during your time as a self-employed person in France. As I've mentioned several times across this series, check your NI record and consider voluntary contributions if you have gaps. The Class 2 route closed in April 2026, leaving only the more expensive Class 3 option at £17.75 per week. But it remains worth doing in many cases given the state pension benefit. One further point, if you have UK clients and receive payment in sterling, the currency conversion creates a record keeping requirement. France wants your income declared in euros. Keep records of the exchange rates used and be consistent in your approach. Your French accountant, if you use one, will guide you on the preferred method. Right, so how do you actually set up self-employed in France? For the micro-entrepreneur regime, registration is done online through guichet-entreprise.fr, a single business registration portal. You'll need your French address, a valid identity document, and your SIRIT number will be issued within a few days. The process is genuinely straightforward. France has made considerable efforts to simplify it, and in this instance, their efforts have largely worked, which, given the general reputation of French administration, deserves acknowledgement. You'll also need to register with URSSAF, the Social Charges Collection Body, which happens automatically through the registration process. URSSAF will set up your social charges payment schedule, monthly or quarterly depending on your preference. For liberal professions, you'll need to consider which professional body or chambre applies to your activity. Some professions are regulated: accountants, architects, lawyers, certain healthcare professionals, and require specific qualifications and registration with the relevant ordre. Others are unregulated and registration is straightforward. One practical point on bank accounts. Technically, as a micro-entrepreneur, you are required to have a separate bank account for your business transactions if your annual turnover exceeds €10,000. In practice, this means a dedicated current account. It doesn't need to be a formal business account with business banking fees. Many expat micro-entrepreneurs use a simple French current account for this purpose and keep records. Even under the simplified micro-entrepreneur regime, you need to keep records of all invoices issued and payments received. A simple spreadsheet works perfectly well. The DGFIP can ask to see these, and the absence of records is not a defence. Let me flag the mistakes I see most often amongst British expats setting up self-employed in France. Underestimating the social charges. The rate of 26.1% on turnover for liberal professions from January 2026 is not modest. Many people set their rates based on what they charged in the UK without accounting for the social charges burden. Price your services with the full cost in mind from the start. Confusing turnover and profit. The micro-entrepreneur regime taxes turnover. If you're used to UK self-employment where you pay tax on profit after expenses, the French system feels harsh if your costs are significant. Model it before you commit to the regime. Confusing the VAT threshold with the micro-entrepreneur threshold. As we've covered, they are different. You can exceed the VAT threshold while remaining a micro-entrepreneur. Many people are surprised to find they need to register for VAT well before they approach the micro-entrepreneur turnover limit. Not registering promptly. You should register before you start trading, not after your first invoice. Backdating registration is possible in some circumstances, but creates unnecessary complications. Register first, invoice second. Assuming the micro-entrepreneur regime is always the right choice. It's certainly the simplest choice. It's not always the best choice. For higher earners, those with significant business costs or those planning to grow quickly, the standard regime or a corporate structure may be more tax efficient overall. And forgetting the S1 implications. As I mentioned, if you hold an S1 and register as self-employed, your social security affiliation changes. The implications for your social charges rate on investment income are material and worth understanding before you register. So, to summarise, the main self-employment structures in France are the micro-entrepreneur, the entreprise individuelle, the SARL and the portage salarial, each with different levels of simplicity, flexibility and cost. The micro-entrepreneur is the most popular starting point for British expats and genuinely works well for service-based businesses with relatively low costs. Social charges from January 2026 are 26.1% of turnover for liberal professions, on turnover, not profit. Income tax is declared on your French return with a 34% abatement for service providers or via the versement libératoire prepayment option. The VAT exemption threshold of €37,500 for service providers is separate from and lower than the micro-entrepreneur turnover threshold. You can be a micro-entrepreneur and yet be VAT registered. Your French self-employment income is primarily taxable in France under the double tax treaty, not in the UK. And if you hold an S1, registering as self-employed changes your social security affiliation in ways that affect your broader tax position. Setting up as self-employed in France is genuinely more accessible than it used to be, but the interaction between French self-employment, French tax, social charges and UK obligations is complex enough that getting advice before you register rather than after your first tax bill is time and money well spent. Next week, I'm covering a topic that affects a growing number of newer British expats, working remotely for a UK employer from France. The compliance issues are significant and most people doing it are not aware of them. Subscribe so you don't miss it, leave your questions below, and I will see you next Wednesday.